This is the 4th part of this manhwa. If you haven't seen the previous chapters, I recommend that you do so. Kana draws her sword and makes a deep cut on the side of the monster. But as she leaps to strike it down, her swords encounter a metal obstruction that halts them. They realize it's Gongti's bat that blocked the girl's swords, protecting what was once his friend. Kana gives him a cold stare and asks him what he's doing, to which Gongti responds, asking her to wait just a moment. However, the girl strikes him so hard in the face that he starts bleeding, leaving the harpooner stunned. Seizing the opportunity, Kana launches herself at the infected Jocko once again, who is still crying out in pain from the earlier cut. The girl leaps to execute the strike, but once more, her swords are blocked by someone else's. This time, it's Sonya, who stands in her way with a worried expression. Kana coldly tells her to move, but the girl refuses, tears in her eyes, and both engage in a confrontation to overpower the other. Sonya reminds Kana that it's Jocko, but she responds that he's no longer human, insisting that Sonya move. Desperately, Sonya tells her she's wrong, pleading with the harpooner not to kill him, and to let him live even in that state. This momentarily makes Kana hesitate as she watches the mutated man growling with a concerned expression. But then he lunges at the girls with a roar. Sonya shouts at him not to, and Kana reacts swiftly, splitting the monster in half with a quick spin. This leaves Sonya in shock, her face expressionless, indicating that he's dead. At that moment, she recalls a conversation they had in the past, where she asked her boss why he did all of this when it wasn't even profitable, especially since their daughter had already passed away. But the man replied that it was for when he would see her again in the afterlife. He wanted to look into her eyes and tell her that he never stopped thinking about her. And we return to see the man's face in a puddle of blood, the whole group looking at his lifeless body. Gongti still in shock from what he just witnessed, as are the others, unable to utter a single word. With her arms still bleeding from the bite, Sonya approaches and kneels before her friend, crying for him but also wishing that he can see his daughter again, and that he should be proud of himself. Then she closes his eyes, finally letting him rest. This causes Gongti to collapse from sorrow as well. Taishan then turns his gaze to the mayor's corpse and wonders why they don't care about his death at all. Now responds that it's because that man deserved to die like that. Now Kana resumes leadership of the group, instructing them to tend to the wounded so they can move on and meet up with the protagonist and Noah. We see the survivors waiting in silence on the platform of Genod's nest. One of them mutters sadly that he doesn't want to become a monster. He stands up and says he'd rather die than turn into one, so he picks up a stone from the ground. Slowly, he enters the water with the intention of drowning himself, until he disappears into the life-giving liquid while the others watch. But the bubbles from his breathing indicate he's resurfacing. Suddenly, one of the tentacles grabs him, causing all the survivors to panic. The female Genod lifts the man to eye level and stares at him angrily, while he asks her what she wants and if he doesn't even have the choice of when to leave. He shouts at her to just let him die already, but the Genod prepares to ensnare him in her capsules, ignoring his pleas. Then a flash appears in the darkness, and we see it's the protagonist, who drops from the ceiling and in a single sword stroke cuts the tentacle that had captured the man. This makes the monster scream in pain. People are surprised that someone just jumped down there. The protagonist manages to catch the man before he falls onto the creature's back. He realizes it's the protagonist, and the survivors are also relieved to see him. At that moment, another flash catches their attention, and we see it's Noah, who signals to the survivors to go that way. So, they hurry, happy that they've come to rescue them. The protagonist desperately asks the man where Lita is, but he simply lowers his head in sorrow, causing the protagonist to look behind him toward the Genod's back where the capsules are located. He sees his sister is already inside one of them, still alive but with a vacant stare. This makes the protagonist scream in despair for the girl. He thinks it's too late, but he doesn't want to believe it, so he runs towards his sister and pulls out a knife. With it, he cuts the membrane of the capsule and pulls Lita out, shouting at her to wake up. But then we see the face of the Genod behind him, just as it uses two of its tentacles to crush the protagonist, causing him to let go of Lita, and no matter how much he stretches to reach her, he can't succeed. The tentacle lifts the protagonist in the air while the capsule regenerates, and the girl is dragged back inside. And the monster slams the boy against the concrete platform, catching the attention of the survivors. Noah calls him an idiot, as he warned him not to fight alone. Only the protagonist's arm and his sword lie outside the tentacle, beneath which there seems to be a puddle of blood indicating his death. But then he grips the handle of his weapon tightly and, fueled by his anger, manages to overcome the tentacle's push and stand up, which surprises the monster. There, the protagonist remembers images of his sister when they were children. With a murderous look, he demands from the beast what the hell it did to his little sister. Then, with a swing of his sword, he cuts the tentacle into pieces. As soon as he finishes, another tentacle prepares to strike him from behind. But the protagonist detects it as well, turning around to easily cut it with a single stroke. Shouting at the monster that he'll kill it, the protagonist lunges towards it and leaps to confront it head-on. The beast tries to nullify this by devouring him with its jaws, but the protagonist activates the gas in his sword and splits the Genod's mouth through the corner, first with a horizontal slash, and then with a vertical one, causing the beast so much pain that it ends up flipped onto its side. The protagonist's fury is not yet over, and the Genod prepares to counterattack with a roar when a bunch of spikes embed themselves in its face, stopping it. These were fired from the protagonist's weapon. He asks if it hurts because the poison they contain, he says, was gathered by all the people whose families the monster ruined. 2 more tentacles try to lunge at the protagonist, but in a single motion, he effortlessly gets rid of them with a clean cut. And in response to the Genod's screams, the protagonist, consumed by rage, tells it that those things no longer work on him. Back with the group in the engine room, they activate the main lever, and with that, they manage to restore most of the energy. Taishan tells them that they can now use the emergency submarines to evacuate everyone. Mao confirms the information, so he orders everyone that it's time to return to their people. But they were already prepared, and they indicate that he was going the wrong way, leaving him speechless and embarrassed. There, Taishan asks if what they have is a bomb, and Kana clarifies that it's a torpedo. Taishan warns them that if something like that explodes, the walls will collapse, and the whole place will come crashing down. But one of the harpooners responds that they already know, as it's their last resort, and Taishan falls silent for a moment. Back in Genod's nest, the beast's blood taints the water of the place red, and we see that, severely wounded, it still roars against the protagonist, who, in contrast, maintains a cold and calm expression. He thinks that its final tremor has finally ceased and recalls his experience with the first monster he encountered, thinking it was too big, its offspring were too many, and it was too terrifying. But the situation is no longer the same as before, because he can't back down now as his sister is still trapped. And this thought reignites his anger, which he says overpowers the terror. And now, the Genod's size doesn't frighten him, it only means there are more places to strike. So, he lunges again, thinking that he'll kill the monster and bring Lita back. The Genod launches its tentacles again, but they hit far from the protagonist. So, he believes the poison is already affecting him and asks where it's aiming. But then he sees that its target wasn't him, but a piece of debris behind him. The Genod lifts it in the air and prepares to crush the protagonist with it. But when the enormous piece of concrete falls, we see that the protagonist is unharmed and airborne, where the harpoon on his sword is pointing, and he fires it towards the beast, hitting it in the neck and piercing through from side to side. However, this is not all, and we see that the protagonist starts circling around the neck, winding the cable several times, until he lands on the back and begins to retract the cable. This tightens the monster's neck so much that it starts bleeding. But it's not enough, so the protagonist puts all his strength into it and maximizes his weapon's power, until the flesh can't take it anymore, and the Genod's neck is severed into several pieces that fall into the water. With a big splash, the monster's head falls into the water, splashing the survivors. As the protagonist prepares to finish off the monster, he lands like a meteor in the middle of its body. He impales his sword and uses the opening to inject the gas inside. This causes the body to swell forcefully until the protagonist shouts for it to die, and the mass of flesh explodes in a burst of guts and blood, leaving the survivors and Noah speechless, with Noah surprised that the protagonist defeated the monster on his own. People start celebrating the death of the beast and the fact that the protagonist saved them, when he appears walking on the back with Lita in his arms, apologizing to her for arriving too late. He enters the water and asks her to open her eyes, telling her he's there now, and people also wonder if it was too late. The protagonist stops on a piece of concrete and starts crying, saying it's his fault and begging his sister to get up. Suddenly, the girl's hand moves, and the water in the area begins to disappear. Noah says it's because the drainage pumps are activating, which means his grandfather must have restored the electricity. But then a noise catches the survivors' attention, and they see that the monster's eggs have started hatching. People panic again, wondering why they have to deal with this now, until finally, the monsters break out of their capsules with screeches and a thirst for blood. So, in the face of the survivors' terrified screams, they dive into the water ready to devour them. The monsters leave the back of their mother and rise ominously for a moment in front of their prey. Then they swiftly launch themselves towards them, while the desperate ones run to safety. Noah warns the protagonist that there are more of them behind him, but he only pays attention to his sister, who says she's not breathing, completely ignoring the danger that is about to take all those present. One of the monsters is about to devour Noah when suddenly he realizes that nothing happened. And when he turns around, he sees that all the monsters have suddenly stopped. Confused, the survivors wonder why they aren't moving. So the boy looks back at the protagonist, and we see that Lita's hand is raised towards them. This cheers up the protagonist, who calls his sister's name, but she ignores him and stands up with her hand towards the monsters, who remain still in front of the girl. The steps of Kana's group approach the area, and she tells them they're almost there, with the thoughts of the protagonist and Lita in her mind. But when they emerge from the tunnel, they are stunned by the motionless sea of monsters standing in front of the girl. When she turns around, we see she has the same monster-like eyes that Jocko had. This leaves the group frozen, questioning her. The group walks towards the others, surprised to have the monsters so close, and Mao asks what's happening. The protagonist climbs back onto the concrete and asks his sister if she's okay. But she doesn't respond, so the protagonist approaches closer and touches her shoulder. However, this causes the girl to collapse into his arms. Later, a submarine emerges from the debris and begins its ascent to the surface. Inside, the protagonist's group sits in silence, with him taking care of his still sleeping sister. But he notices her blue veins, so he covers her better with the blanket. While stroking her head, he softly tells her that they're finally going home. The other harpooners, however, fear the girl and feel nervous in her presence, keeping their weapons ready in case something happens. Sonya sees them and remembers that Jocko ended up turning into a monster in the end. So, she wonders if it will be different with the girl. Kana also observes Lita without saying a word, thinking she looks like Jocko when he got infected. So, she might also be infected, but in that case, she can't explain what she saw in the chamber. Back in the ruins, people board the last submarine, and Mao tells Taishan to get in because they need to leave. But the old man says he won't be joining them. This surprises Mao and the children, who try to go with him, but Taishan closes the hatch in their faces. They shout for him from the other side, and their grandfather tells them he's too old to adapt to a new life. But they are young and must move forward, so he presses the button, and the submarine shoots off into the ocean. Left alone, Taishan apologizes for not being able to go with them, but as he pulls out his gun, he says that one day they'll understand, because that place was everything to him, and the children must go to a better place than this. At that moment, we see them inside the submarine, when suddenly a noise from the outside grabs their attention. The hatch opens, and they are greeted by the dazzling light of the outside world, as their grandfather calls them the last children of the underground city of Marmota. As they step out to see the outside world, he asks them not to be afraid so that they can continue living in the new world with the new people. This makes them both cry, as it's the first time they see the sky. Back in the ruins, Taishan drags the torpedo to the area filled with monsters. Among them, he says, are his friends, brothers, his son, and even his wife, whom Genod took from him. And he says he hasn't forgotten for a second, as his hatred against the monster never stopped. The only reason he kept going was to reach this moment. So he says this is for his people. And while shouting at the monsters to burn in hell, he pulls the trigger of the torpedo, causing it to shoot out and impact one of the beasts, exploding and carbonizing them all. This triggers the collapse of the structure of the chamber, and it starts letting in all the water from outside. Within seconds, the ruins are flooded through chambers and tunnels, carrying supply crates and debris to the outside. Back at the port, a lookout spots the submarines that have just surfaced, and the whole town realizes that the rescue team has returned. People run to the port to welcome the rescue team, and as they approach, Mao shouts to them that Genod is dead and the village is safe. So, everyone celebrates and realizes that many of the missing people have been rescued. They rush to greet them, and there is an emotional reunion filled with hugs and tears. Kana observes this from a distance, smiling as she witnesses all the happiness. However, the protagonist crosses the crowd with Lita in his arms, wearing a grim expression and not joining in the celebration. One of the villagers notices this and asks him if Lita is okay. Without turning, he simply replies that she's fine, just asleep, and continues to his house. Another villager whispers the truth to the boy, who is surprised to learn that she's infected. Sonya asks Kana what the protagonist plans to do, as rumors will spread immediately. She reminds her of what happened with Jocko, and that it could mean the entire village is in danger, that Lita could destroy everything, but Kana only questions if that's really the case. While Sonya is puzzled by her response, a noise behind them captures everyone's attention. They see that it's the large heritages, beginning to emerge one by one in masses towards the surface. This brings so much joy to everyone that they can hardly believe it, including Sonya. But then Kana tells Sonya that she doesn't think Lita will destroy the place, because both of them saw what happened, and the reality is that they escaped thanks to her. So, both the protagonist and Lita could be the key to understanding what happened. However, Sonya says nothing. The sun begins to set in the village, and we see one of the villagers thanking Kana, stating that without her, they wouldn't have had a chance. The girl says it was a group effort, but everyone around her insists on thanking her. Mao tells her she doesn't need to be modest, as she's a heroine and everyone is grateful to her. However, Sonya and Gongti don't look at her favorably. Mao asks Kana how Lita is, and she, somewhat somber, tells her that she's still sleeping, and it's as if she were a newborn. We then move to the boy's house, where Lita is handcuffed to her bed, sighing and squirming. Then Gongti loudly wonders if Lita will still be human when she wakes up. Mao asks what he's talking about, and the harpooner says he's wondering if she'll turn into a monster like Jocko did, because she was also inside that egg sack. Sonya asks if they aren't just having false hope, as a monster is a monster, but Kana remains as cold as ever. Mao tells Sonya that Kana had no choice but to kill Jocko. But the girl says that's precisely what she's referring to, hitting Kana's table, and she asks her what she will do when Lita becomes a monster and if she'll be able to kill her too, causing her to raise her gaze with fear. We then return to the boy's house, where the protagonist watches over his sister with a somber expression. At that moment, we see the boat where the protagonist and his sister lived with their father, and the protagonist walks through it, asking where Lita is. Then he hears some sobs that catch his attention, and when he turns around, he sees his younger sister crying in a corner. Worried, the protagonist approaches her, and the little girl reminds him that she asked him not to leave. The protagonist starts crying and apologizes to her, telling her he won't leave her alone anymore. But then she holds onto him tightly, and while saying once again that she told him not to abandon her, she lifts her head, and he sees her transformed into a monster, lunging at his neck and biting him. The protagonist then wakes up and wonders what that was, realizing it was a dream. But then he turns his gaze slightly and sees his sister sitting on the bed. Kana walks through the nighttime atmosphere of the village, wondering if she'll be able to kill Lita if she turns into a monster. She observes her hands, contemplating whether they'll be able to deliver the final blow, and clenches them with determination. Kana arrives at the house and announces herself to the protagonist, when suddenly she's surprised to see the protagonist and Lita sitting, drinking something warm. The girl greets her with a warm smile, then rushes toward her, embracing her tightly while apologizing for causing so much worry. Kana returns the hug and welcomes her back, thanking her deity for her safe return. They continue to have dinner, and Lita tells them about what happened when she entered the egg. She felt herself slowly fading away, getting lost in the darkness to the point of starting to forget who she was. We see her sinking into emptiness until suddenly someone calls her name, and she asks who they're talking about. This makes her lift her head and see her mother, who tells her that her name is Lita. The protagonist is surprised that she saw her mother, and Lita admits that she had never seen her face before. But she really felt like her, as if her mother was protecting her despite dying because of her. The protagonist firmly tells her not to say that, stating that it's a lie. But the girl thinks that her mother died right after giving birth to her, so she would have lived if not for her. However, she interrupts her thoughts and takes a bite of the food, which surprises her, and she says it tastes very good. Kana tells her that the restaurant owner made it for her, so the girl laughs and says she's very happy to be able to eat her food again. This brings a lot of joy to Kana, who asks her to keep eating. The protagonist also thinks that she's still the same old Lita, as she's exactly the same as before, and he thanks his deity. Later, we see the girl vomiting all the food into the water. She wonders what's happening, saying that the food felt disgusting. She looks up, feeling dizzy and with her stomach grumbling, mentioning that she's too hungry. Suddenly, she notices some fish swimming near the shore. With a swipe, she catches one of them between her hands. Lita brings it close to her mouth, thinking that she's hungry, and takes a bite, devouring it in just a few seconds. She remains confused because it tastes so good. Then, a smell reaches her nose, and she wonders what it is, as it doesn't smell like fish. She turns toward another side of the village where she senses it's coming from. She stands up, and with a quick leap, she starts running on all fours toward that direction. While wondering what the smell is, she finds it so sweet and irresistible that she can't help drooling at the thought of eating it. We see her eyes turning into those of a monster again. Lita reaches the source of the smell and comes across a pile of massacred bodies. She's surprised and asks if they are corpses. She sees everything covered in blood and realizes that's where the smell was coming from. Startled, she realizes that the scent that attracted her was human blood. Furious, she wonders why it smells so sweet and approaches one of the bodies. She thinks she can't stop herself and is about to bite the neck when a man appears and kicks her into the water, then steps on her. The man asks her what a brat like her is doing awake around here. He then approaches her face, pointing his knife at her and asking what it is. He recognizes her as the girl who worked at the restaurant, and after taking off his mask, we see that he's the pirate who caused them trouble, whom Lita also remembers. His accomplice asks him if he wants to kill her, but the pirate tells him not to be so rude. He says that it's because of that kind of behavior that they're still called pirates, although the accomplice insists that they are indeed pirates. There, Lita understands that they killed the guards to take the great inheritances. She squirms and yells for him to let her go, but the man threatens her with the knife and covers her mouth, telling her to shut up or he'll have to kill her. However, the girl bites his hand so hard that it makes him bleed and scream in pain. The pirate looks at his hand and sees that the girl tore off all the flesh, so he angrily yells at her. But she keeps her face lowered, and we see her greedily licking her blood-stained lips. There, the man strangles her and says that she's the girl infected by the monsters from the depths. He asks her if she wants more and puts his hand over her mouth, making her drink the drops of blood as they fall. As they do, Lita thinks she can't stop, as the red liquid is too sweet. She thinks she's losing control, and her body smiles at the taste as the drops fall. The pirate has fun seeing the girl trying to get more, but one of his men sighs and tells him they don't have much time. Suddenly, he sees something rapidly approaching his head. In an instant, his head is torn off by a swipe from Lita. The henchmen carrying a box see the lump fall into the water and are terrified to see it's their boss's head. They drop the box and draw their weapons to shoot at the girl. In just a few seconds, she closes the distance, jumps onto them, then lands on the bald man, kills him, and shoots off to the next one. She slams the next henchman against the box they were carrying and kills him upon impact. Standing up, she looks at the remaining survivor with a monstrous and murderous gaze. The remaining pirate draws his knife while trembling with terror and holds it in front of him, telling the girl to stay back. He waves it in all directions, ready to hurt her if she comes closer. But almost without looking at him, Lita manages to grab his arm and break his wrist, causing him to collapse and scream in pain. Lita only thinks that she's very hungry and opens her monstrous jaws because she wants to devour the pirate. Just then, Mao and the harpooners arrive and ask who's there. The pirate turns around and yells that it's a sea monster, putting the harpooners on guard. But when they stop to observe with the light, they realize that it's Lita. The pirate takes advantage of their hesitation and stabs her in the shoulder, causing the girl's flesh to mutate and swell to the point of making her scream in pain. Mao shouts at the girl, and the pirate manages to take cover behind the harpooners, telling them to hurry up and shoot her. However, Sonya orders them not to, drawing her sword and saying that she'll take care of it with a cold and ruthless expression. Lita growls at the girl, who tells her she's doing it without resentment and promises to make it as painless as possible. They then lunge at each other, exchanging a series of blows that leave Lita in the water. But the battle doesn't end there, as the girl gets back up with a leap. Sonya tells her to stay still or it will only make the execution worse. She clarifies that she has no choice because she's not human, and promises to make it quick. But then the protagonist appears and stops her. Sonya says it's too late and that she's not his sister anymore. But the protagonist ignores her and asks Lita if she can hear him. She seems to respond for a second, but then lunges at the protagonist with her mouth open. He doesn't move despite Sonya's warning. The boy catches his sister, holding her tightly. He tells her everything is alright because he's there, but she doesn't listen and bites his shoulder. She angrily pulls, tearing his skin as Sonya and the harpooners watch in concern. However, the protagonist shows no sign of pain and only tells his sister that he's fine, and that he won't leave her alone, as they are a family after all, and he's there for her. With all the calm in the world, he embraces her and asks her to please come back as his little sister. So, the girl stops, and we see her once again submerged in that abyss of darkness, where her name begins to reach her. Like when she was in the egg, she asks who is calling her and who Lita is. And suddenly, all the memories, from the moment she was born to when she protected the boy from Genod's tentacle, start flashing in her mind. So, she remembers that Lita is her name, and her mutated flesh begins to hiss and shrink, something that Sonya and the harpooners notice, until the girl returns to normal, and tears well up in her eyes, while she cries and apologizes to the protagonist, as she believes something is wrong with her. There, Lita thinks that someone like her shouldn't have been born, as if it weren't for her, her mother wouldn't have died, and her father and the protagonist wouldn't have suffered. She reveals that she always missed her mother, and she loved her father and her brother so much that she felt incredibly guilty. So, she tried really hard not to be hated and to be a good girl loved by everyone. But now that she's turned into a monster, she doesn't know what she should do. She cries, saying that she's a monster, but the protagonist insists that she's not, because she will always be his little sister. There, we see Kana observing the scene from above and thinks that she can't kill Lita even if she's a monster. So, she begins to think if there's a way for Lita to remain human. And she concludes that the only way to cure her is to seek Dr. Foyd, who is in Union Busan, because he's the only one capable of treating her. And she decides that they must return to the city ship. Dawn arrives on the following day, and we see that the protagonist, Lita, and Kana are getting ready to leave the village. Mao asks the harpooner not to go, as she's the only person who can be the head of the oasis port. The villagers tell her the same thing, as they don't know what to do without her guidance. But she tells them that one person alone is not enough to change that place. And she argues that there were people who led the fight when Genod attacked the village, just as there were those who shared their food and helped each other. So, in reality, she says that there are already many great leaders there. Mao wants to insist, but the cook stops him and tells them that they've already loaded medicines and equipment from the grand inheritances onto the ship. So, he thanks everyone for protecting the village and says they'll use their own hands to make it a better place. Therefore, they're welcome to come back whenever they want. The protagonist expresses his gratitude, and some children approach Lita to give her flowers as a thank you for saving them. And she remembers that they were the ones she pushed away so that Genod wouldn't devour them, so she's glad they're safe. Then her mother comes out and quickly takes them away from her, which worries her. But the cook tells her not to let it affect her, as they're just scared. And he knows that the kind and hardworking girl is still in front of him. So, he asks her to make sure to improve so she can come back. Sonya tells them that they've had enough farewells and that it's time to leave. Kana thanks her for allowing them to go with her, to which the harpooner says it's nothing, because she's leaving for her own reasons as well. Finally, everyone sets off towards the ocean, while Mao laments Kana's departure. On their way, Gongti asks Sonya if she isn't being too kind to them, to which she responds that they don't have anything else to do anyway. And she's just tagging along to see what happens, as Lita was infected but managed to become human again. So, she thinks she might hold the key to finding a cure for the fish disease. This was Jocko's goal, and that's why she says with a smile that she wants to finish what he started. This leaves Gongti speechless at first, but then he responds with his own smile, telling her that Jocko would be proud. At that moment, the children run to the bridge and are amazed to see it as a control room. So, the girl asks angrily why they brought the kids, and the harpooner tells her it's because they saved their lives and said they wanted to see the world. Sonya asks if it's their father, and he blushes at the idea, rushing to hug them and warning them not to damage the ship. Then the girl asks how they'll find Union Busan in the vast ocean. Kana tells her that the Unionists always go to the commercial port to exchange goods. So, that's their destination, and she's about to input the coordinates into the ship when Sonya interrupts her, reminding her that she's the ship's captain, which Kana accepts. This satisfies the girl, so she allows Kana to input the coordinates, who smiles at her and says she knows she's a good person. This makes her smile, and we see all the characters doing the same, while the protagonist thinks that he will save Lita no matter what happens, where they have to go, and no matter the cost. After a few days, we move to the two massive towers of the commercial port. It's explained that it used to be a large organization consisting of 5 clusters of buildings, but after 3 of them collapsed due to a typhoon, its influence was significantly reduced. However, it continued to be used as the main hub for the exchange of goods. We see the arrival of the Union Busan at the commercial port, which the merchants announce with excitement. They approach with their boats to offer their products to the citizens of the enormous ship city, from engines and dried fish to clothing. The city's harpooners say they don't need fish and announce that they will only allow people selling clothes to enter. Dr. Foyd is also present, supervising the merchants, and he seems to be looking for someone. Suddenly, the shouts of one person catch his attention. The person tells him that they brought the fish he ordered. This pleases the doctor, and he orders them to be let in immediately. The other merchants are annoyed because they said they didn't need fish. One of them approaches to grab onto the tarp covering the product, but a harpooner hits him to keep him away, causing him to take the tarp with him. And it reveals that the product is a pile of huge organs, including an eye and a heart. This leaves everyone puzzled. The harpooner tells the merchant to hurry, and the doctor asks if they are fresh. The boy confirms this. For instance, the heart is still beating. So, the doctor congratulates them on the good work and asks them to bring the rest as soon as possible. He He then orders them to be taken to his laboratory. Inside the laboratory, we see a massive tank where the scientists work. They say the pressure is stable as well as the heartbeat. They start the food transfer and introduce the heart into the tank through the connected pipes. The beast inside devours it in a matter of seconds. A scientist then informs the doctor that the monster is eating on its own. So, he looks through the window and says they finally did it. Outside, the group led by the boy who sold the organs wonders what the hell they plan to do with them. Another person responds that it doesn't matter as long as they get paid. The leader explains that they are exchanging organs from sea monsters that they can't even eat due to the gas they contain. So, it's in their best interest to milk their customers for all they're worth. The fleet of merchants returns to the port and announces that Union Buun just ordered some clothing, so they plan to bring everything they have. There, we see some workers removing organs from sea monsters. The leader tells his crew to hurry, as they need to make at least one more trip before sunset. Suddenly, someone tells him that it's been a long time since they've seen each other, and we see that it's the protagonist and Kana, who says it's been at least 6 years. The leader sweats in fear upon recognizing her. The girl watches the ship city from a distance and says they will leave after 3 days. The boy says he thought she was dead after the disaster she caused in Union Buun, and then she reveals that they need his help to get on board. The boy asks why he should help them since his situation became complicated after helping the protagonist's father, and he just made amends with the ship city. But the girl tells him that all debts must be paid, as it's the unwritten rule of the commercial port. The boy claims he doesn't owe her anything, as it was the protagonist's father who saved him, and Kana confirms it, so the protagonist removes his hood and reveals his identity. The boy sees the resemblance so much that he calls the protagonist by his father's name, Tianma, but the protagonist clarifies that he's not him, but his son, and he tells him it's his chance to repay his debt. The group sets off on the boy's ship, and he curses for being forced to fulfill his oath. The protagonist asks Lita to hold on a little longer, and she replies affirmatively. We see her hidden among the enormous jars of monster organs. The merchant asks Kana why she's trying to return when she could live her life avoiding them, because if they get caught, they'll all be dead. But Kana only responds that she already knows, and the merchant tells them to get ready because they're about to arrive. The small boat approaches the city, and Sonya is amazed, as is the protagonist. He hadn't seen it in 4 years. The merchant announces that he's carrying more goods for Dr. Foyd. But then the protagonist spots some harpooners watching them from above, and he sees that one of them is Dohu, whom the protagonist looks at with murderous eyes. But Kana quickly forces him to lower his head so he won't be recognized, and tells him not to make a sound. The ship city opens its gates again, and the harpooners tell the merchants to hurry up and load the goods because the sun is almost setting. We see everyone in the protagonist's group nervous, especially Lita, who trembles in fear. Then someone tells them to stop, as they need to check if the numbers are correct. The man pushes Kana to inspect the content, and Lita worries about Kana and her brother, thinking they're going to get caught. The merchant also thinks that if they get caught, they will all be killed on the spot, and that it's all over. But when the man lifts the tarp, the girl sees that it's official Lee, who also recognizes her and says that everything is okay. So, the merchants can continue moving the goods. As they pass, Kana and the protagonist nod in his direction. The official is glad that they have returned to Union Buun. Sunset arrives, and the official leads the protagonist's group through the corridors of the ship. Sonya is surprised because she had never been on board, and the protagonist thinks that the ceiling seemed higher back then, just like the alleys, which now feel narrower. The group keeps walking when suddenly the protagonist sees a familiar figure. He realizes that it's Mr. Huring, who says that nothing has changed. Mr. Huring seems to recognize them, but instead of speaking to him, he addresses official Lee and asks if he's already off work. The protagonist realizes that he wasn't recognized, but he's relieved to see that everyone is well. Official Lee tells them that more people who know them might appear, so they should return to the market street. Lita asks her brother if he thinks the grilled fish place she liked is still there, and he replies yes. The official opens the door and leads them to that section. But as soon as they enter, the protagonist is surprised. The entire place is empty and lifeless. The group walks through the street, and Kana asks what happened to the market. Official Lee reveals that someone contracted the fish disease, so water is being rationed to prevent its spread. They pass by a section with a water tank, where people gather to request their ration. Lee explains that after the water price skyrocketed, the market had no chance. Now water is being directly managed by the leaders. They see an harpooner discovering a man hiding a water bottle in his shirt. He notifies his colleague that the man stole it. The man kneels and pleads for mercy, explaining that there are 4 people in his family. With just his ration, they won't last the whole week. The harpooner kicks him and tells him to stay quiet, saying he broke Union Busan's laws. Despite the man's apologies, the harpooner hits him and insists that the law is absolute. Kana tries to intervene, thinking that the punishment is too severe just for water. But official Lee stops her and warns her that this isn't the old Union Busan anymore. They see a child observing the scene. The harpooner lifts the man by his clothes and shouts to the others that the law must always be respected. As punishment, the rations for the day are now gone because of that man. The people beg them to continue, saying they won't make it until the next rationing day. Suddenly, the child appears and kicks the harpooner. He yells to everyone that water is a right. Another harpooner raises his weapon and orders the child not to move. But before he can shoot, the protagonist rushes forward and deflects the officer's weapon. The officer opens fire, and the bullets hit the tank just above his colleague. This causes the water to start leaking. And before the harpooners can stop them, the people approach with their containers raised to collect the vital liquid. Grateful, the official says it's good to have them back. The child celebrates with the people, but the harpooner orders them to catch him. So, the group takes him away, as officers will arrive in groups. The child thanks them for the help when suddenly they notice Lita standing still. She asks her brother if he hears that, to which he responds that he doesn't sense anything. And suddenly, Lita leaps into the air with a loud crash. The girl goes flying and leaps between the railings, so the protagonist jumps to follow her, and behind him are the girls. The group reaches an upper floor, but when they turn around, they don't find Lita, until the protagonist finds an uncovered sewer, which leads us through a long path among the pipes. At the end of it, they find Lita, who discovers Dr. Foyd's laboratory and asks the monster inside her why it's so angry. Then the doctor sees her and asks her how she got there. Sonya comes out of one of the hatches that Lita passed through, and the group follows her trail to the laboratory, where they find a bunch of capsules with specimens of sea monsters. Kana asks what this place is, as even she has never been there before. The protagonist wonders where his sister went, when he peeks around a corner and finds her in front of Dr. Foyd. Although he doesn't turn to look at her, he's surprised that Kana is still alive. He tells them that the girl is quite fascinating, as the mutation of the monsters is attacking her entire body. But despite that, she's able to maintain her human form. He asks her what happened to her, as there are two entire worlds fighting within her body. Bill, who comes across the scene the protagonist's group caused in the water tank, and asks his subordinates who did it. The officer tells him it was a masked man and woman. But Dohu is furious that he let them escape and kicks the officer against the tank, leaving him writhing on the ground. There, he sees an M painted on the tank, which infuriates him even more, and he cracks his knuckles. He then orders a bunch of guards to find the troublemakers and take them away. Back with the doctor, the group tells him that Lita emerged from Genod's egg and was able to control the monster's offspring. So Foyd says this could be due to the fact that the kid's mother had the fish disease. This surprises everyone, who wonders if the ability and recovery from the mutation were truly thanks to the fish disease. Sonya learns this for the first time and asks if an infected person can give birth to a healthy baby. But Dr. Foyd says it shouldn't be possible, and what happened with Lita was a miracle, as in reality her mother held on until the end. He tells the kids that the fact that their mother was infected and both of them returned to the ship after being born almost feels like destiny. Because as the fish disease spread throughout Union Busan and killed countless people, everyone thought it was an inexplicable plague. But he disagrees and explains that it's a disease that had already spread throughout the entire ocean. He then tells the story of the catastrophe where 130 years ago, a comet crashed into the moon, breaking it into pieces. This caused debris and water to rain down on the earth for 70 years. And with them came the fish disease, which caused any infected marine creature to mutate into monsters. While all humans whose bodies rejected this change contracted the fish disease. This surprises Sonya and the protagonist. The doctor continues, saying that 15 years ago, the disease spread throughout Union Busan. And the one who set the stage for this tragedy was the mother of the protagonist and Lita, named Narissa. She was the daughter of a wealthy upper-class family, who hated boring things, so she hung out with people from the lower class all the time and explored ruins with divers. We see her telling Tian that she found a strange pot, and he explains what the ancients called a chamber pot. But she still decided to keep it in her collection because it looked odd. And Tian jokes that if she keeps it up, Union Busan will sink soon due to the weight of her collection. and she tells him to get their own boat for when that happens, and they proceed to kiss. Foyd recounts that one day, the divers were doing an exploration when Narissa discovered it. A capsule with strange engravings. She took it to Dr. Foyd and asked if it was a treasure. He told her that there was no rust or marine flora on its surface, and its interior was empty, so he would need to conduct further tests as he had never seen anything like it. But then he tells that the patient zero was a diver who participated in the dive with Narissa that day, who slowly began to spread the disease, which they discovered had a 100% mortality rate. And with that, terror gripped the ship, causing people on the ship to blame the refugees for spreading the disease and force them to leave. And we see that they were left to their fate in the sea, with others unable to do anything but remain silent and watch. Besides the disease, he says it became an effective solution to get rid of the undesirable and solve the population explosion that Union Busan was facing. However, people began to realize this and tried to rise up to fight the lie. This led them to be suppressed by the harpooneros, but Tian wasn't one to be swayed by the fear of the masses. So he stopped Dohu and fought for the refugees, starting a just resistance that saved many lives. Narissa asked the doctor to tell everyone the truth, that the infected were part of her diving team, and that the numbers weren't even increasing, so they shouldn't be doing all of that. But Foyd told her with regret that the upper classes already knew everything, that the disease wasn't a plague, as they were seeking that massacre. This made her cry endlessly until she suddenly saw that she had the disease's scales on her skin. The doctor recounts that due to her betrayal, the couple ended up leaving Union Busan. But the fish disease would continue to consume Narissa, who we see pregnant. And the doctor tells the kids that she couldn't survive the mutation, but somehow managed to give birth to both of them. So he's sure she passed on some traits to them. And he asks the protagonist if he had already realized that the two of them were different. So the protagonist and Sonya remember their conversation about him being able to hold his breath for a long time, even though he didn't know how. Dr. Foyd says the female Genod probably noticed this too, and that's why she chose Lita, who she felt was the most similar to her, to become her successor. Although the mutation was interrupted because the protagonist took her out of the egg too soon. Foyd finds it wonderful as it resulted in a perfect balance, and he says he will need time to study her little by little. Kana asks the doctor if there's any way to cure the girl, but he asks why he would cure her when she's perfect, and asks them again how long they think humanity will last on a water-covered Earth, as the concrete islands will eventually collapse under the waves, and the giant ships will end up with holes and damages. So humanity doesn't have much time. They need to change if they want to survive. Kana asks the doctor in fear what he's talking about, when suddenly they hear loud thumps coming from the huge tank in the lab, and the doctor wonders if it's hungry again. The protagonist asks what's inside that thing, and Foyd tells them to take a look. But before he can peek, huge jaws attack the window. These turn out to be from a tentacle, which slowly retracts to reveal a monstrous humanoid form. There, the protagonist says it's something he's seen before and wonders where. Suddenly the monster starts taking on a human form, and in front of the protagonist's chills, it transforms into the face of his father. So the protagonist says it can't be. And behind this, the enormous eyes of the real monster appear. Dr. Foyd says that's to save humanity. But then we see the monster's smile, and the protagonist recognizes that it's Kentrassi, the one who killed his father. Furious, the protagonist asks the doctor why he brought Kentrassi back, but he doesn't respond directly, only saying that it took him 4 years to start eating on his own again, and that he's a valuable specimen. Kana says it's too dangerous and asks the doctor to stop, as he's one of the 7 demons of the ocean. But Foyd insists that the potential benefits make it a risk worth taking, and Lita arrived just when they needed her. Kana clarifies that they're there to turn Lita back into a human, not to assist with his monstrous experiments. But the doctor asks if she can say Lita isn't human just because she looks a little scared. He steps behind her, placing his hand on her shoulder, and asks the harpooner how she defines what is human and what isn't. Because if they don't adapt to the new oceanic planet, humanity's fate will be extinction, just like the dinosaurs of old. So humanity needs to evolve. However, Kana steps between him and the girl and tells him to back off. The protagonist draws his sword and says they can't let Kentrassi live. So everyone arms themselves and prepares to kill him when Foyd realizes something. Suddenly, the entire troop of harpooners appears and tells the kids not to move. They turn and ready their weapons as the harpooners insist they stay put. The protagonist asks how they knew they were there, and suddenly Foyd appears behind him and injects something into his neck, while telling him that's his mission. So, the protagonist collapses to the ground, baffling the others. Then the man in charge appears and tells the doctor he did a good job, and he greets Kana, mentioning that it's been a long time since he last saw her. The man is Bangbeak, captain of Union Busan, whom Kana recognizes. He asks them to lower their swords, explaining that he's there to talk, which Kana doubts. But the captain tells her he heard everything they said about wanting to cure Lita through a microphone in the lab. And he says they can do it for her as long as she cooperates with them. He believes that dialogue is the best way to resolve such conflicts, so Kana agrees to hear their terms, and the captain orders his harpooners to lower their weapons and escort the guests inside. Moments later, Kana and the captain step outside to talk. He mentions that the ship is an impressive vessel, as it has protected them from being submerged for over a century. Kana remains silent, so the captain adds that even a steel ship like that can sink in an instant if the system collapses. He asks her to look up, so Kana raises her gaze and sees the mark of an Eme. He tells her that the spirit of Tianma is returning among the lower decks, and that there have been 3 disturbances just this week. Kana reminds him that they are not troublemakers, just people who want to drink water. But the captain tells her that segregation cannot be avoided, and the ship's resources cannot be equally shared among everyone. Kana says she won't help him suppress the people, but the captain tells her he doesn't want her for that. He wants her to do her thing, to become a harpooner again, a heroine who kills sea monsters and saves people. Confused, Kana asks what he means, and the captain replies that they can't give resources to the people, but they can give hope, as hope is priceless, which surprises and upsets the girl. The captain tells her she's perfect for this role, a refugee who rose to become a prominent member of the harpooners. So, she's the perfect model to show the lower decks the hope that can replace their dissatisfaction. Kana initially refuses, but the captain asks if what she wanted was to cure Lita. He tells her they've been investing a significant amount of money in the research of Dr. Foyd's fish disease. So, if anyone can cure her, it's him. Kana knows this, and that's why she came back. And he says they will provide her with everything the ship has, from money to information, to cure Lita. He extends his hand towards Kana, asking her to choose between taking his hand or rejecting it. Dawn arrives on the ship, and the protagonist opens his eyes in a very spacious and luxurious room. He's surprised by this and wonders what happened, when suddenly an old butler wishes him good morning. The protagonist asks where he is, and the man responds that he's on the highest deck of the ship, and he welcomes him home. This confuses the protagonist, who gets dressed and wonders if this is a home. The butler then leads him to another room, where he finds Sonya, Gongti, Noah, and Ling. They are happy to see him and tell him he looks good. He immediately looks for his sister and asks where she is. So the butler opens the door and signals to the girl that it's time. Lita enters as well, dressed in new clothes, which makes Sonya blush because she looks very pretty. The butler is also very happy and says it's like seeing Narissa again in the flesh. Lita asks if he's referring to her mother, and the butler says he's very glad to have been able to serve both the protagonist and her again. He introduces himself as the household butler and explains that both of them are descendants of the 27th generation of the renowned Suan Clan. This clan used to run a huge food conglomerate before the submersion, and is one of the 10 great families of the Union Busan. They were also responsible for the food production facilities on this ship. Sonya scolds the protagonist for hiding when he was so wealthy, but he replies that he didn't know either. The butler starts to cry and laments that Narissa fell in love with Tianma, whom he calls a thug. And he says there's still much to talk about, but since the food will get cold, he asks them to eat first. The group is surprised by the feast prepared for them. Sonya starts eating and says she's never seen meat like that before, which the butler explains is called Hanwoo beef. Gongti does the same and asks if he's in heaven because it's all the food he's never seen before, and the butler explains that what he's eating is called japki. Then Lita picks up a fruit, and the butler tells her it's a fruit known as an apple, and that there are only 10 apple trees on the ship, planted as symbols by each of the 10 families that built it. She thinks it's very beautiful and smells great. The butler tells them that all of those things were rightfully theirs, and he's very glad to finally be able to serve both of them. The protagonist looks around and notices countless bottles of whiskey on the wall, and the tap provides unlimited hot water. But then he remembers the tap at the tank, and the harpooners suppressing people for wanting more water, and he reflects that they are mistreated because of it, while the upper classes use water even for bathing. So he wonders if everything belongs to the upper classes just because they were wealthy 100 years ago. In that moment, he remembers Kana and wonders where she is. So he rushes out of the bathroom, thinking that something might have happened to her. The protagonist leaves the room, but upon opening the door, he comes face to face with a harpooner, who turns out to be Dohu. He mistakes the protagonist for Tianma, and in a mixture of fear and anger, he asks why he's still alive. But then he looks at the protagonist more closely and realizes that he's not his father. So the boy grabs his arm and twists it forcefully, making Do-hoo kneel before him. He asks him who he thinks he's touching and warns him that he'll regret it if he treats him like the same boy from 4 years ago. Then he realizes that the man looks much smaller, and he wonders if he was always like that. For he was the one who threatened 13 and 9-year-old kids, and even tried to throw someone overboard for a few coins. The protagonist wonders how many more evil things Do-hoo has done during his time on that ship, and he considers that maybe he should kill him right there, which sends a shiver down the man's spine due to his bloodlust. But then the protagonist releases him. The butler appears and yells that it's enough and explains to the harpooner that the captain granted Narisa and Tian-ma a complete pardon. So now their children are the legal heirs of the Na clan, and if he tries to threaten them, he'll be threatening one of the great families of the Union Buun. This surprises the harpooner, and the butler asks if he's sure he can handle the consequences. But then the protagonist interrupts them and asks the butler if he knows where Kana is, which terrifies the harpooner, having heard about the girl's return. And that's how the 4th part of this manhwa ends. If you have made it this far in the video, let me tell you that you have been one of the few people to get here, so comment the word Leviathan in the comments. Remember to subscribe so you don't miss any videos. With that said, see you in the next video.